Hi, my name is Jen. It's another wonderful day to have a book in your hand. I'm going to be talking about the first half of 2026 and more specifically the books that I read. I read about 120 books in between January 1st and June 30th. And I want to talk about the ones that stood out. Before I move forward in this video, I want to quickly address the things that are behind me in your line of vision because I know that all of us are a little nosy. I want to know what's behind us in the videos. You're going to see a lot of books. You're going to see some wigs. You're going to see some postcards, a record player, a pinata that I used in an audition in college to get into an experimental theater group, and it actually did work. And shout out to Control Group for being so strange and unusual. And then you're also going to see a massive penguin. Um, so, with for no further ado, um, I'm going to talk about the first book, which is the most underrated. Now, I am talking about underrated in the sense of book that is rated poorly on Goodreads, but I think deserves to be rated higher, which is not the actual definition of underrated. I am referring to it in this particular way because that's how I want it. And so the book that I thought was excellent, I gave it 5 stars. I had a great time reading it. Was Indiana by George Sand. This was published in 1832. It's a French novel from sort of the Romantic period, and it's 272 pages. I loved this book. I thought it was such a good time. It's quite possibly similar to the best TV that you could possibly imagine, just pure melodrama. But I thought it had some great psychological insight and also some dreamlike sequences that were really exciting. And I thought that George Sand did an excellent job of building tension in a way that was very compelling. And by the end of it, it had a message that was honestly kind of uplifting and sort of sweet. And I mean, yeah, I can see why people didn't like it. I can see why it has 3.5 or lower on Goodreads because it is kind of melodramatic and it does kind of go to those places where it leans into the ridiculous. But I also think that it works to the advantage. And I think that George Sand is playing into the tropes with a little bit of a keener eye than those reviewers might be giving her credit for. So that's how I feel about Indiana. I do think you should read Indiana. I think it's a great book, and you can decide for yourself. So the next book that I want to talk about is the most surprising, and in my opinion, the book that was the most surprising to me, as in I did not expect to find it this year and enjoy it so much, is The Story of the Stone, Volume 1 by Cao Shuishen. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. You can go ahead and tell me how to pronounce it in the comments, please. This is a Chinese long novel, first published around 1760. This particular volume was 525 pages. This is the rest of the novel sans volume 1. So it goes on. In the introduction, they compare it to a sort of older Chinese Proust because it's also about the upper classes. It also sort of revolves around art and poetry and leisure time. And it has this sense of sprawl and so many characters. So I loved Proust. I read all of In Search of Lost Time, really loved it. And this does feel kind of akin to it, especially because they do something that I really love, which is they just sit around and quote poetry to each other. That's awesome. I love that for them. It's as though their sense of entertainment is just quoting poetry all the time, which I think is wonderful. I think we should bring that back. Instead of Netflix, we should just sit around saying poetry to each other. This particular edition is translated by David Hawkes. One thing I also loved about this novel that is something I want to draw attention to is the way that every chapter ends as though it's saying, if you want to find out what happens in the next chapter, you have to read on. It actually says that. every chapter ends on a sort of note of intrigue, and there's this line that says, if you want to know more, you're going to have to read on to the next chapter. And I guess the reason why I include this as my most surprising is because I had never heard of this novel. It was totally not in my literary landscape. I was in my local used bookstore one day, and in the far back corner that was dimly lit, there was a selection of the 5 volumes of this Chinese classic that I had never heard of. And I bought the first one, started reading it, and immediately thought to myself, this is awesome. I love this. So I went out. I didn't have any money, but I was so desperate to read this particular Chinese classic that I had never heard of that I actually traded in a bunch of books at the used bookstore so I could acquire the rest of the volumes, which I just showed you a moment ago. And so now I have this sprawling Proustian Chinese epic, and I am so excited to continue reading it. The next book is Most Underlined. And for this book, I chose Works of Love by Søren Kierkegaard. I had never read Kierkegaard. I don't read much philosophy. I do find that most philosophy feels very circular. It tends to chase its own tail a lot, in my opinion. And I bought Works of Love by Kierkegaard over 10 years ago and never read it for this reason. I thought it was going to be too difficult. But once I got into the rhythm of this book, I enjoyed it immensely. It's translated by Howard and Edna Hong. It is from the year 1847. It's originally translated from the Danish. Kierkegaard was Danish, and it is 353 pages. It's mostly talking about Christian love, but in this case, Kierkegaard is talking about love, about talking about God in a way that feels Christian, but also not the born again sort of variety that you might see in the 21st century or in some centuries past. It doesn't have it has all the mysticism without having the dogma, I feel like. And so, and what I'm trying to say is that his definition of God is almost akin to community. And that's what's really moving about it. I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but I did love underlining so much of this book. So much of it really resonated with me. And just talking about love, talking about God being love. I think there's generally a consensus that love is a kindness that you do to one another, even even in the midst of suffering. So and that he said it in a lot more of a profound, gorgeous way than I just did. But I spent a lot of time underlining different ways to think about that. My favorite chapter was Love Hopes All Things and Yet Is Never Put to Shame. That was my favorite chapter. So if you're gonna buy it and just read one chapter, just read that one and see how you feel about it. I also felt like this was philosophy that kept me at the edge of my seat. I was always curious about what kind of thing he was going to say next. I never knew what was going to come out of his mouth. And I also loved that he would make up a poet and just abuse him. He kept saying, imagine a poet. You know, the poet would do this or would do that. So there's a sort of, and I've seen this in other philosophy books. I know that Plato had a certain feeling about poets that was derogatory. I think it's so funny that different philosophers, when they try to make a point sometimes, will just say, imagine a poet, get a load of this guy. And the last thing I'll say that he does use circular sort of thinking, but I also think that he uses repetition to his advantage. So he'll often repeat a similar thing, but in a different way. And so that's why I ended up underlining so much, because it felt as though there were similar things being said, but just with twists or turns or a circle that was twisting in on itself. So, we're going to talk about the best dialogue. And in my in my case, I thought the best dialogue was in a book by James Schuyler called What's for Dinner. James Schuyler is mostly known as a poet. He's an American poet, but this novel in particular, I think he has like 2 novels. This novel in particular was published in 1978. And it's very light and breezy, but it's about a couple where the wife goes to the psych unit because she has a mental breakdown. And so the entire book, she's dealing with her substance abuse problem, and also she's sitting around in the psych unit going to group therapy and just trying to survive. But it is so funny. It is so breezy. They're talking about serious topics that a different author would cover in the most depressing way. But the fact that there is so much lightness to the characters, that they retain so much of their good humor, I admire that. So this is the best dialogue. We're on to the most disappointing book of the year so far, and in my opinion it was Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. This was published in 1916. He's Irish. It was 196 pages. This book was billed to me as a book that isn't as difficult as Ulysses, but is more complex than Dubliners. And I think that's probably true, although I haven't read all of Dubliners yet. I still think I'm not a fan of Joyce. It's just, I've tried. I read Ulysses. I read this book. I even wrote down in my little review here that I love Stream of Consciousness, and I love it when Woolf does it. I love it when other modernists do it. I love Faulkner. But Joyce, I just feel as though he's doing it in the most off-putting and annoying way. It's deeply not for me. I also want to talk quickly about a poetry collection that was disappointing as well. And in this case, it was Flowers of Evil by Charles Baudelaire, translated by Aaron Puchigan. And this was published in 1857. It's 159 pages. Daniel Handler in the afterword described it as poetry for 12-year-olds, and he meant it in a complimentary way. I forget the context exactly, but I couldn't see myself as a 12-year-old particularly enjoying this, or myself now. I did not think it felt so incredibly shallow and without substance, nothing going on there. I don't know if I'm missing something. I feel as though I'm missing something very obvious about it. I feel as though someone is going to knock on my door and say, "You don't understand Baudelaire. He's actually doing all these amazing things that you don't understand." But I found it so dull and just without flavor. It's not for me. I'm sorry. The funniest book of 2026 so far is The Code of the Woosters by P.G. Wodehouse. This was published in 1938. It's from an English author. And this is where Ask Jeeves comes from. I don't know if any of us from the early 2000s remember the alternative to Google that was Ask Jeeves. And this is where Jeeves comes from. Jeeves in this book is the butler. And this novel, this whole series of books revolves around a rich kid who keeps getting into trouble stupidly, and his butler gets him out of all of these situations. Always at the right exact moment. This book is so funny. I was smiling the entire time. The best nonfiction was The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. I have not read much Du Bois, and I'm so glad that I'm finally doing it. This book in particular is a collection of essays that revolves around sorrow songs, or songs that slaves sang in the fields or with each other in community settings. Um, it is a mixture of history, both covering slavery and Reconstruction, but it's also a personal recollection about his own life, his own experiences with racism. This book was published in 1903. American author. It's 197 pages. I wonder why I didn't read this in school. I should have at least read selections of it in school. It is so beautiful. It is so profound. I loved this book. I know that Du Bois also wrote fiction, and I'm happy. I'm so excited to pick up some of that as well. Some of the sorrow songs cover more divine or godly aspirations, and it was really beautiful how he intertwined that with earthly considerations and the reality of life in America for Black people. Just, you have to read it. The best poetry was Goldsmith Market by Liliana Ursu. And this was translated from the Romanian. It was originally published in 2003 and it was 185 pages. It was translated by Sean Cotter, who I think is the same person who did Solenoid, but I'm not sure. So most of these poems are quite short. They often have these shocking language choices, these gut punching endings, and they're so compact. And I also appreciated that it was a dual edition. So my beloved speaks Romanian. He's from Romania. He grew up there. And usually Romanian poetry is not published in a bilingual edition. It's not as popular of a language, I guess. And he read the translation side by side with the original language, and it was, maybe I am so partial to this particular book of poetry because I was able to read it and appreciate the English translation. And then he sat next to me and said, oh, that's an interesting word choice here. I can't believe that they chose this word instead of that word, and that's how they translated it. And it was a conversation that I don't often get to have when I talk about poetry or when I talk about literature at all. So this book in particular has a special resonance with me. I really do think that the poems are excellent. I don't know if this book is out of print. It might not be available anymore, but do look up Liliana Ursu. She's amazing. She's got some zingy endings, great images. She's a great poet. Check her out. The best cover was City of Fiction by Yu Hua. This was published in 2021. It is translated from the Chinese. It's 427 pages and it's translated in this case by Todd Foley. I picked it up specifically because I thought the cover was so interesting. It's those eyeballs. I know I put it up here. You can see the eyeballs staring at you. In fact, it was so scary that when I was reading it, I would sometimes have it in bed next to me and I would turn it upside down so I wouldn't have to see the eyes staring at me as I slept. It's about a man who is looking for a wife, can't find one, and then a woman shows up at his door and is like, I'll be your wife. I'll be your wife. And so they get married and she runs away and he is looking for her. And I'm pretty sure all of this is pretty much in the flap. It's not too much of a spoiler situation, but it's a quest novel. It's a novel about looking for somebody and trying to find them all across this area of China, looking for a place that may or may not exist. It's also about misconnections. It's about bandits. It's also pretty horrific. Some of the details are really horrifying that they include in this novel. But I will say that it's always done with the most gentle hand. I was reading this novel and I felt as though it was smooth on my brain. Do you know what I mean when language just goes right through your brain like a sieve? It worked out for me because even though I did judge a book by its cover, I did give this book 5 stars and I did think that it was a successful purchasing experience. I will say, however, that this book is not perfect because I do think that there were some opportunities in the plot that they could have taken that they didn't. And in that way, it is a little disappointing. But because I just mentioned how smooth it was, I always looked forward to picking this book up. And not every book does that to me. Not every book gets me excited to pick it up. And just on that merit, I gave it 5 stars. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to a small press that I really love that is uh, headquartered in Massachusetts. And I know the man who runs the whole thing. I know how much work he does for it. So I wanted to shout out Bodily Press, which I've read 2 books by them, one by Elliot Cardinal, who is the founder of the press, and one by Desireen Carr, who's a friend of mine as well. And I just love the poetry they publish. I think they do a great job. I also want to shout out a small press, a university press. I actually read The Red Wind Howls by Sering Dundrup, which is a Tibetan author. It's published in, or maybe translated in 2025. I can't really tell what is going on there. And then it is 289 pages, translated by Christopher Peacock. And I've never really read a book about Tibetan religious leaders who were thrown into prison camps by the communists in China around this time. Just had no idea about any of that was going on. Did not know anything about it. So I think that's also an amazing thing that you get from university presses and also just small presses in general, because they take a book that might not sell that well in the common market because it's not so structurally integrated. It's not written with a certain eye for marketing. It's not any of those things. It's written because it has this important story that it wants to tell. And I think that's why I'm so glad that university presses and smaller presses take chances on these books and publish them so that I can come across them in a bookstore and go, I don't know anything about Tibet. Let's read about Tibet and their history. I don't know. I could learn something. That's a cool thing about reading. You learn things. I also want to give a quick review of a book that I thought deserved the award that it got. In that case, I'm talking about Angel Down by Daniel Krauss. This was published in 2025. It's by an American author. It's 285 pages, and it won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction this past year. This book was very controversial because it's technically considered horror. And that is very unusual for the Pulitzer Prize board to choose something that isn't straight up literary fiction. And this author is also mostly a screenwriter. He wrote The Shape of Water. I forget when that came out, but he wrote it. He's like collaborated with Guillermo del Toro. In this case, Angel Down is a shocking novel about World War One, where a bunch of low life losers in the army are corralled together by their commander, who kind of hates them and says, "Hey, buddies, like you have to go out in no man's land and shut up whoever is making that shrieking sound. You can either," and he doesn't say this, but he implies that you can either kill them, you can save them, I don't care, they just need to be quiet. And so these guys go into the field and they find an angel that has fallen into no man's land. And it becomes a question of what do you do with an angel? I thought it was so well done. It's told in one sentence, which some people might get intimidated by, but I thought in this case that one sentence was broken down into the most bite-sized pieces. There were paragraph breaks, there were chapter breaks. You could put your bookmark in wherever you wanted. It was so easy. There are other books like Septology by John Fosse that I read a while ago. That is 600 or 700 pages that are one sentence, no paragraph breaks. You're just in for the ride, the alcoholic Norwegian ride. This book is not like that. This book knows that's taking a risk, but it does it in a way that's almost not risky at all. It's the safest way to take a risk, is the way that he does it here. I almost cried at the end of this book. It was so moving to me how he pulled it together. I think this deserved the Pulitzer. Now, a book that I read that I don't think deserved the award that it got is Blindness by Jose Saramago. This book was published in 1995. It is translated from the Portuguese and it's 326 pages. It was translated in this case by Giovanni Pontiero. And the reason why I mentioned this book not deserving its award, it's a Nobel winner. Maybe he does deserve the Nobel. I haven't read his other work. I know that the Nobel is a prize given for a body of work as opposed to one book in particular. But this book was exceedingly bleak, just so bleak. This asks the question of if blindness were an infectious disease. And so everybody goes blind, except for, you'll see who doesn't go blind. There's a lot of violence in this book. There's a lot of disgust, a lot of shocking images. And actually, that's not what bothered me about this book. I can deal with bleak books, even if they're almost laughably bleak and depressing. The thing that bothered me more about this novel was the ending, which just felt so convenient and okay. It was as though Saramago chose the ending that was just easiest at hand. Maybe the rest of his books are really good and he deserves the Nobel that he won. But I don't know. I can't say off this book, I don't think he deserved the Nobel. But maybe his other ones are really great. I know he has another one called Sight or something. So, assumedly, everybody is enjoying their eyesight in that one. Finally, at the end of this video, now that you've made it this far under the eye of the giant penguin, we are going to talk about my top 3 books of the year so far. And the first one is Here's Your Hat, What's Your Hurry by Elizabeth McCracken. This is published in 1993. It's American, 214 pages. It is short stories. I was depressed when I read this book. I was having a hard time, and it really felt like a shock to the nervous system. So if you're looking for a book that will kind of energize you in a way that you're not necessarily going anywhere, you're not necessarily doing anything different, but it feels like the world is a place that you can live in a little bit easier. This is the collection that you need to read because it's about freaks, it's about weirdos, and it's just about weirdos and freaks who just want to be loved and are trying to love each other, and people who are trying so hard to love one another. In this case, it often ended on a note of not, it's not saccharine, but it does have a sort of sweetness to it, a feeling that this is a noble endeavor to try to love and be loved. And that was really moving to me. My number 2 favorite book of the first half of 2026 is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Oh my gosh. I started this book several times and thought that the first page where Orlando is playing with a severed head was a bit much. And then recently, in the first half of this year, I started reading it more seriously and was so glad that I finally delved into it and got past the first page, which was off putting to me for whatever reason. I love this book because Virginia Woolf often writes with a sort of melancholia. I feel as though I read her books and I grasp that she has suffered as a person. Sometimes I think that is very apparent in the work that she writes. In this book in particular, I think that she is having fun. I think she's having a good time. And that is so beautiful to me, that this person, this genius of literature, can suffer and can write about suffering, but can also write about having fun. And I just feel as though this book was an experiment for her. It's about a man who turns into a woman, who turns into a man, who lives kind of forever and is a poet and just hangs out and has sex and whatever. It asks so many questions about life and art and eternity and memory and answers them with joy. We can have fun answering these questions. They're not always so sad, so depressing to consider these deep seated questions. And I think that's what was really moving to me about this book, Orlando. Now for my favorite book of 2026 so far, which is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This book was published in 1956. It is an American author. It's 169 pages, so it's a relatively short book. And it's a new favorite about 2 gay men trying to be in love, and they can only be themselves in Giovanni's room. And it's heartbreaking. It's so devastating reading this book because obviously it's during a time when that sort of thing is absolutely not allowed, and it's in like Paris, France. It's in Paris, France, I believe. I would give this 1,000,000,000 stars if I had access to the technology. It covers love and the complexities of love and care, what it actually means when you're confronted with the reality of loving someone, and the decisions that we make in youth, the sort of things that we think we want, and then the things that are closer at hand. It's just, I also think that this book is meaningful to me because I found a first edition in my grandma's old house after she had died. And I found out that it was not my grandma's, but her mother, her mother who had bought this book in the 1950s. I just think it's cool that my ancestors had good taste in literature. That they also went to the bookstore and were looking for something that would change their life. And I hope that it changed my great grandmother's life because it changed mine when I read it. And I think, and not necessarily in a huge material way, it doesn't change. It might not actually change who I am as a person so much, but it does change how I feel about art and what art can do. And I really, when I read this book and when I read it, I just felt absolutely, I stood in awe. I stood in awe of what literature could do, what it could do to me, what it could do to people, and how it could make us feel. It's the best book that I've read so far this year. Thank you so much for being here with me today and listening to me talk about books. I would like to do it again. We'll see how it goes. Say goodbye, Big Penguin. This is like Good Night Moon. Good night, Big Penguin. Good night, Pinata. Good night, Jen.